In the age of pharaohs, tombs that defied time. What if the pharaohs never built tombs for the dead, but weapons against time itself? The tombs were never graves. They were traps set for time, engines of stone that defied decay, silence, and even memory. The pharaohs did not seek immortality of the flesh. They sought to carve eternity into walls, to bend centuries into obedience. The stones that remember more than we do. You stand at the threshold of something you cannot name. The Age of Pharaohs is presented to you as a museum exhibit, a timeline curated neatly by archaeologists and historians, but beneath the glass in the tour guide's voice is a wound that never healed. These tombs, these impossible architectures, were not echoes of the past, but deliberate intrusions into your present. They were not designed to preserve bodies. They were designed to outlast your memory, to outlast even your ability to question what came before you. The pharaohs were not kings of land or people, they were kings of duration. Consider this, a civilization measured not by its conquests, but by how violently it resisted erasure. Most empires rot into fragments, into forgotten scripts and broken ruins. Yet Egypt did something stranger. It folded its intent into stone itself, compressing wool into blocks of limestone, granite, and diorite so dense that even millennia of wind and sand could not silence them. These were not monuments. They were experiments in survival, psychological, spiritual, temporal. And you, in staring at them, become the subject of that experiment. The tomb is a paradox. Every sarcophagus is supposed to contain, to limit, to seal the dead from the living. Yet the Egyptian tomb functions in reverse. It radiates outward, distorting the minds of those who approach. Every inscription, every hieroglyph is not simply a record but a device, symbols calculated to bend perception. To read the Book of the Dead carved into walls is not to learn history, it is to be altered by history. These are not texts that teach, they are texts that reprogram. You know this even if you resist it, because science has already given you the language. In psychology, there is the illusory truth effect. Repeat a lie often enough and it becomes indistinguishable from memory. The pharaohs understood this long before experiments in cognitive bias were performed. Hieroglyphs carved in darkness, repeated across chamber after chamber, created a reality in which the king was no longer man but God, in which death was no longer end but transformation. Imagine walking through a labyrinth where every wall repeats the same command until it bypasses doubt and lodges directly into your sense of self. That is not art, that is neurology in stone. And then there is the problem of the body. Why were pharaohs mummified with such violent precision? Why were organs extracted, jars sealed, corpses wrapped in resin and linen, placed under crushing weight? Archaeologists say it was religion, a belief in the afterlife. But ask yourself, what belief system would pour so much obsession into resisting decomposition? This is not faith. This is fear, fear of entropy, fear of impermanence, fear that identity itself could be dissolved. The tomb was a denial not of death, but of time. But there is something darker beneath this denial. Modern physics whispers it in equations too vast for casual thought. The second law of thermodynamics, entropy always increases, order always collapses. And yet the tombs stand, they should not. These stones should have fractured, crumbled, been lost like every other ancient structure exposed to centuries, but they did not. Why? Was it architecture alone, or was the architecture a statement against physics itself? The pharaohs built machines of stone to declare war on entropy, and somehow they won. For if you are reading these words now, you are already standing in proof of their defiance. Imagine for a moment that memory itself is like sand, slipping constantly, impossible to hold. Then imagine building a container that could hold sand without losing a single grain. Impossible, yes, but the tombs approximate this. They hold not just the corpse of a man, but the very illusion of permanence. You walk among the ruins, and in your mind, Egypt is eternal. But eternity is the illusion they wanted you to carry, not the truth. Here is where the collapse begins. History itself is distorted. What we call ancient Egypt is not history, it is programming. The real Egypt is gone, lost to floods, fires, invasions, and forgetting. What survives are not facts, but deliberate remnants, tombs engineered to overwrite what was lost. You are not learning Egypt, you are learning the Egypt they designed to survive. It is not the past you face, it is an edited version of the past that has colonized your perception. The pharaohs have reached across thousands of years and sculpted the inside of your mind. This should unsettle you. When you enter a museum, when you stare at a pyramid, when you imagine the golden mask of Tutankhamun, you are not remembering history. You are participating in their experiment. Can a civilization outlive even its own death by implanting its image in all who come after? And if so, whose voice is in your head right now, yours or the pharaoh? The stones are not mute, they are speaking, and they are speaking through you. Their survival was not accidental, it was targeted, a time capsule that does not preserve but infects. You are not reading about Egypt, Egypt is reading you. And what if that was the only purpose of the tomb? To create a future where no one could escape the pharaoh's gaze. The tomb as a machine against time. You have been taught to imagine the tomb as a monument of silence, a stone container holding the stillness of a vanished age. But step closer and you begin to see it not as architecture but as mechanism, a machine whose gears are ritual, whose circuits are symbols, whose fuel is belief itself. The pharaohs did not build for aesthetics. They engineered devices intended to manipulate perception across millennia, and you standing in the present are proof that it worked. Consider the way the walls are lined with texts, endless litanies, repeated invocations, diagrams of gods, maps of the underworld. Archaeologists translate them as funerary prayers, guides for the soul. But step out of the museum's sanitized explanation and recognize the psychological violence at work. Every word was repeated, every symbol mirrored, every god illustrated with impossible precision until the mind of the visitor, whether priest, mourner, or intruder, was locked in a loop. The tomb was not merely a container of the body, it was an operating system written in stone. Psychology stumbled on this pattern thousands of years later. The Milgram experiment revealed how easily obedience could override morality when authority was framed as absolute. The pharaohs had no need for electric shocks or white lab coats. They encoded authority into the very walls. When you are surrounded by inscriptions declaring divinity carved into the eternal medium of stone, resistance dissolves. You do not question, you obey. The tomb is the experiment, and every generation since has been its subject. Now think of the architecture itself. Corridors descend at impossible angles, chambers misalign with natural geometry, false doors and shafts multiply like deliberate confusions. Why, these were not mistakes. These were disorientation devices, labyrinths calculated to fragment linear perception. The human mind craves order, but inside the tomb order collapses. Every turn contradicts your memory of the last, until your sense of direction is annihilated. This was not to deter grave robbers, this was to fracture consciousness. You cannot emerge unchanged from such an environment. Science confirms the effect. The Rosenhan experiment demonstrated how context dictates perception. Sane individuals admitted into psychiatric hospitals were treated as insane because the environment dictated the judgment. Inside the tomb, even sanity is reprogrammed. A shaft pointing upward becomes a stairway to the gods. A sealed chamber becomes a sanctuary of eternity. The architecture dictates what you see, what you think, what you believe. You cannot escape the frame, it frames you. And what of time? Every inscription insists not only on immortality, but on recursion, the endless return of cycles, the rising of Ra, the weighing of the heart, the rebirth of Osiris. Linear time is dismantled. The tomb does not narrate history, it erases history. Step inside and you are no longer in 2500 BCE or 2025 CE, you are in the eternal present the pharaohs engineered. To them, defeating time meant defeating chronology itself, collapsing past and future into an infinite loop of now. Physics whispers the same paradox. The block universe theory and relativity suggests that time is not flowing but static, all moments equally real. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously. The pharaohs anticipated this not with equations but with stone. Their tombs were block universes, chambers where all moments coexisted, sealed in walls that never age. Walk through them and you no longer traverse history, you traverse a simulation of eternity. Even the body inside is part of the machine. The mummy is not a corpse, it is hardware, organs removed, fluids drained, bones hardened with resin, a transformation from organic matter into engineered artifact. What appears to be death is in fact conversion. The pharaoh becomes not man, not God, but data encoded in flesh, stored in a stone casing awaiting transmission across centuries. What you call mummification was their form of information technology, the encryption of identity into matter. And if you think this is exaggeration, recall how fragile our own digital storage is. Hard drives decay in decades, magnetic tapes lose fidelity, servers corrode. But a tomb cut into bedrock, layered with stone, sealed with sand, outlives entire civilizations. The pharaohs invented permanence by turning themselves into artifacts, into data carriers resistant to entropy. They hacked the second law of thermodynamics not by revering decay, but by slowing it so drastically that even 5,000 years later, you still read their command, remember me. But what is memory and what is obedience if they are indistinguishable? If every encounter with Egypt is an encounter with the pharaoh's will, then who survives, Egypt or you? Each photograph of the pyramids, each tourist's awestruck gasp, each academic paper published in sterile journals is not evidence of objective study. It is the tomb still functioning, still bending minds, still commanding reverence. The pharaoh does not need to live in body. He lives in you, in your fascination, in your surrender to the illusion of eternity. So you must ask yourself, when you stand before these stones, are you the observer or the observed? When tombs became experiments in consciousness, you have been told that the tombs of the pharaohs were temples of silence, repositories of faith, but what if they were laboratories, vast psychological experiments encoded in stone? What if the priests and architects were less builders of monuments than engineers of the human mind? Step carefully, because once you see the tomb not as architecture but as experiment, you can never unsee it. Consider the sarcophagus chamber. It is not a resting place, it is a sensory machine. Darkness absolute, silence engineered, air so heavy with stone and resin it suffocates thought itself. Modern psychology calls this sensory deprivation. In the 1950s, Donald Hebb's experiments revealed that when deprived of external stimuli, the brain begins to collapse in on itself. Hallucinations, time distortion, identity fragmentation. What Hebb stumbled on with white noise and blindfolds, the pharaohs had already perfected with granite and limestone. They built chambers where the mind unraveled itself, where perception dissolved and imagination became indistinguishable from reality. This is why the tomb walls glow with gods, with hybrid creatures, with visions of death and rebirth. The environment was not passive, it was the trigger. To step into a tomb was to undergo controlled madness, a ritual designed to collapse the ordinary mind and rebuild it under the pharaoh's image. The afterlife described in the carvings was not meant for the dead, it was an induced hallucination for the living. And if you think that absurd, recall that every religion thrives on carefully engineered states of altered consciousness, fasting, chanting, darkness, incense. Egypt was simply more direct. They built architecture as drug. But here is the fracture: if tombs were laboratories, then who were the test subjects? Not just priests, not just initiates. Everyone who ever entered, even you now reading these words, becomes participant. The experiment was not limited to the Nile Valley. The experiment extends across centuries, across continents, across languages. The pharaohs did not test the limits of consciousness once, they are still testing them now. Think of the split-brain experiments in the 1960s. Surgeons severed the corpus callosum of epileptic patients, leaving each hemisphere of the brain isolated. What followed was terrifying. One side could see what the other denied, one hand could act in opposition to the other, consciousness fractured into two competing realities. The tomb performs the same surgery, but not on the brain, on history itself. One version of Egypt exists in textbooks, dates, dynasties, catalogued artifacts. The other exists in shadows, whispers of forbidden knowledge, rituals designed to manipulate the mind, truths too destabilizing to publish. Both realities coexist but cannot reconcile. Step into the tomb and you feel the split, what is preserved and what is concealed. And then there is sound. The architecture is not silent. The chambers resonate at precise frequencies. Acoustic engineers have discovered that some burial chambers hum at 111 Hz, a frequency known to alter brain states to induce trance. Was this accident, or was it calculation? Every echo of footsteps, every chant, every cry inside those walls becomes magnified into a vibration that enters not just the ear but the body. The tomb becomes a resonant chamber, tuning consciousness like an instrument. Imagine priests chanting not for gods but for frequencies, voices calibrated to sculpt the very brainwaves of those present. And you thought these were just graves. The deeper you descend, the clearer it becomes. The pharaohs were not obsessed with eternity for their own sakes. They were obsessed with yours. They wanted to see if a mind could be bent not for a lifetime, but for all lifetimes to come. If you can still recall their names, if you still tremble at the image of the pyramid rising from the sand, then the experiment succeeded. Your awe is the data. But what does it mean if entire civilizations can become laboratories? The Stanford prison experiment demonstrated that roles alone could transform ordinary students into sadists or victims within days. Egypt's tombs operated on the same principle: invert space and role, and the living become the dead, the visitor becomes the prisoner, the pharaoh becomes eternal not by body but by control. The tomb was not a burial chamber, it was a stage, a script you were forced to enact. Step back now and realize every photograph, every documentary, every schoolbook that keeps the pharaohs alive is not neutral. It is continuation. The tombs are still running, still bending minds, still performing their experiment across centuries. You do not look at them, they look at you. You do not interpret them, they interpret you. And so the question grows unbearable. Were the tombs ever meant to bury pharaohs at all, or were they meant to bury you? The pharaohs who engineered eternity. You have been told that the pharaohs worshipped gods, that they offered their wealth and labor to secure a place in an imagined afterlife. But what if the truth was inverted? What if the pharaohs were not worshippers at all, but engineers, architects of eternity who used divinity as raw material? They were not building tombs for the dead. They were building control systems designed to outlast empires, languages, even memory itself. Look carefully at the hieroglyphs. Each image is a compressed idea, a symbol not just of sound but of force. The Eye of Horus is not decoration, it is mathematics encoded into fractions that map the human body with surgical precision. The Ankh is not an ornament, it is a cipher of opposites, the loop and the line converging into a geometry of life and death intertwined. To the archaeologist, these are quaint religious motifs. To the pharaoh, they were code, visual algorithms designed to manipulate perception. Modern science rediscovers fragments of this. The observer effect in quantum physics insists that the act of looking alters what is observed. Egypt built this into its theology. To gaze upon the symbols is to activate them. To enter a chamber lined with endless eyes, endless gods, endless repetitions is to become participant in an experiment where your awareness is not passive but weaponized. You do not simply see the tomb, you complete it. And then there is the paradox of kingship itself. The pharaoh was man but also God, flesh but also eternal principle. Historians call this political theology, a convenient fusion of religion and state, but ask yourself, what does it do to the human mind to be confronted with a figure who is simultaneously mortal and immortal? It creates cognitive dissonance, the fracture that psychologists study under names like dissociative identity disorder. Two realities mutually exclusive, both held as true. The pharaoh became the original experiment in doublethink, the king who could die and yet could never die. The tomb amplified this dissonance. On the one hand, the corpse dry, brittle, silent. On the other hand, inscriptions declaring that same body eternal, unbroken, resurrected. The visitor is forced to hold both truths at once, the undeniable evidence of decay and the insistent proclamation of immortality. In that contradiction, belief is not destroyed, it is deepened. You are no longer dealing with reason, you are dealing with a mind trapped in paradox. Philosophy has a name for this, the ship of Theseus. If every plank of a ship is replaced, is it still the same ship? Egypt asked a darker version. If every moment of a pharaoh's body is replaced by symbol, by stone, by ritual, is he still a man or has he become eternity itself? The tomb becomes the site where identity is no longer tethered to flesh but transferred into symbol. You are not standing before a dead king. You are standing before the continuity of a paradox that cannot end. And what of time itself? The pharaohs did not measure time in years. They measured it in recursions, the endless rising and setting of the sun, the eternal return of Nile floods, the cycle of death and rebirth. Their architecture mirrored this. Corridors doubled back on themselves. Chambers aligned with solstices, equinoxes, star risings. You are trapped in loops. You cannot progress forward, you can only circle. The tomb becomes not a line but a spiral, an infinite recursion designed to collapse your sense of progression. History tries to domesticate this, calling it religion, mythology, symbolism, but you can feel the fracture beneath. The pharaohs were not storytellers, they were programmers. They encoded recursion into stone, ensuring that every generation who entered the tomb would find themselves circling, looping, repeating the same questions. Why did they build? What did they mean? What were they hiding? The very act of asking keeps them alive. Your confusion is their immortality. And then comes the unbearable thought, what if the tombs are not merely about Egypt at all? What if they are prototypes, machines proving that perception itself can be engineered, that entire civilizations can be programmed to obey symbols across millennia? If so, then Egypt is not the anomaly. Egypt is the blueprint. So you must ask yourself, when you see a pharaoh's tomb, do you look at the past, or do you look at the operating system running beneath all of history? The tomb that outlived memory. You think history is an archive, a collection of dates and artifacts preserved in museums. But the tombs of the pharaohs prove otherwise. History is an illusion curated by what survives, and survival is never neutral. The tombs are not passive relics, they are active filters deciding what you can and cannot remember. They are the editors of time. Consider the Library of Alexandria, that great repository of ancient knowledge burned into absence. What remains? Fragments, second-hand accounts, whispers. Its destruction leaves you with silence. But Egypt's tombs, sealed in sand, locked beneath stone, outlived fire, flood, and conquest. Their persistence did not merely preserve knowledge, it erased alternatives. The story of the pharaohs is not the story of Egypt. It is the story of what Egypt allowed you to see. Every lost fragment of history is overwritten by the stubborn endurance of these tombs. You remember them because they forced you to. And memory itself is not what you think it is. Modern psychology exposes this with brutal clarity. The false memory experiments of Elizabeth Loftus show how easily recollection can be rewritten. Tell a subject enough times that they were lost in a shopping mall as a child, and eventually they believe it, even supply details. Memory is not archive, it is construction. The pharaohs knew this instinctively. They did not rely on what people remembered. They carved memory into stone, repeating it until the mind bent to its will. Every hieroglyph is a false memory implanted into eternity. But what happens when memory is more durable than fact? The Nile Valley once housed thousands of villages, countless lives, entire cultures lost to silence. You cannot recall their names, you cannot picture their faces. What you do recall are pharaohs, pyramids, tombs. The monuments dictate what you think of as Egypt. In that sense, the tomb is not a record, it is a weapon. It has replaced living memory with curated illusion. This is why tombs defy time. They do not simply resist decay, they erase competition. Every alternative history crumbles, but the tomb remains, and so the tomb becomes history itself. And you, your awe, your fascination, your endless repetition of their story are complicit. You are not remembering Egypt. You are remembering the pharaoh's choice of what Egypt should be remembered as. Philosophy describes this collapse in the paradox of the brain in a vat. If all your perceptions were fed to you artificially, how would you ever know what was real? The tombs perform this trick across civilizations. They feed you a version of the past so absolute, so overwhelming that you cannot distinguish it from reality. You believe you know Egypt, but what you know is what survived. What survived is what was engineered to survive. And what was engineered to survive is not truth, it is control. Look deeper at the architecture. Chambers aligned with Orion's belt, shafts pointing towards Sirius, walls recording cosmic cycles. These alignments are not religion, they are time locks. The pharaohs tied their memory to the stars, ensuring that as long as the heavens turned, their story would remain synchronized with the cosmos. This is not mythology, this is encryption on a cosmic scale. You cannot forget what is tethered to the stars themselves. And then consider the cruelty of time. Empires rise and collapse, languages are born and die, entire peoples vanish. Yet Egypt remains, repeating itself in every textbook, every documentary, every pyramid silhouette stamped on the human imagination. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself who benefits from this persistence. For if memory can be engineered, then your very sense of history is not yours, it is theirs. So you stand before the tomb, not as visitor but as subject. It has already edited your mind. It has already chosen what you will recall, what you will forget. You are not reading about pharaohs, you are reading the memory they placed in you. And the question echoes louder than stone. If history itself can be rewritten by what survives, then what part of you has already been buried by their tombs? The silence that was never silent. The tomb appears empty, still, sealed in dust and stone, yet silence is the greatest lie it tells. The absence you imagine inside those chambers is not absence at all, it is density, pressure, resonance. The tomb is not quiet, it is saturated. What you mistake for silence is a carefully engineered medium, one that still speaks to you even when you hear nothing. Stand inside the burial chamber and feel the weight. The silence presses against your body like water, crushing, suffocating. This is not accident. Stone thickness, geometry, angles, all of it tuned to create a sensory collapse. Acoustic researchers have discovered that some pyramids amplify even the faintest sounds, while others cancel them into void. Whisper inside and the walls swallow your words. Your voice is consumed, leaving you with the terrifying realization that speech itself cannot survive here. And in that annihilation, your mind turns inward. The tomb does not quiet you. It forces you to hear yourself until the boundaries between self and chamber dissolve. This is not mythology, this is neurology. In the 1950s, John Lilly placed test subjects in isolation tanks, warm water, darkness, silence. Deprived of input, their brains began to invent reality, visions, voices, presences. The pharaohs discovered this thousands of years earlier. Their tombs were sensory deprivation chambers on a civilizational scale. Priests entered in ritual, kings lay embalmed within, but the architecture was the constant. An environment designed to strip the mind of reference until it hallucinated eternity. What then is silence? In physics, silence does not exist. At the atomic level, particles vibrate ceaselessly. Even in the vacuum of space, quantum fluctuations ripple. Absolute silence is impossible. The pharaohs seemed to know this. Their chambers were not mute, they were resonant, tuned to frequencies that bypassed the ear and entered the body. Measurements reveal resonances at 111 Hz, a frequency linked to altered states of consciousness. Was this an accident of stone? Or was it deliberate construction, a technology of trance hidden in limestone? And then consider the dead themselves. A wrapped body placed in such resonance is no longer inert matter. The silence around it is not passive, it is vibration. The pharaoh's corpse becomes a receiver, a resonant object pulsing in darkness for eternity. To the modern mind, this seems superstition. But consider, if a human skull resonates, if bones vibrate, if consciousness is not separate from matter but bound within it, then the mummified body was not dead. It was tuned, preserved as an instrument the tomb could continue to play. What unnerves you is not that these chambers exist, but that they outlast perception. You imagine silence, but what survives is influence. Every visitor who enters a tomb comes out altered. Every archaeologist, every tourist, every scholar leaves with echoes in their mind, impressions that refuse to fade. This is not symbolic, it is experimental. Silence itself is the experiment. How much influence can be exerted without words, without sound, without direct command? The answer is all of it. The absence itself becomes the message. Philosophy touches this terror in the problem of the void. Can nothingness exist, or is nothing always something disguised? Egypt answered with stone. The tomb is emptiness shaped, silence carved, absence that endures. In staring into it, you realize you cannot escape the presence embedded in absence. The tomb is not silent, it is still speaking, and it speaks by erasing. This realization fractures your comfort. If silence can be engineered, then what you hear, and more importantly, what you do not hear, is already chosen for you. The pharaohs decided the frequencies you would encounter, the echoes you would carry, the voids that would devour your voice. And so when you imagine you are free from their influence, you are most enslaved. You thought silence was empty, now you understand it was full and it was never yours. So the question sharpens. If even silence can be constructed, then where in your world have you ever heard your own voice at all? The tomb that outlived its pharaoh. You believed the tomb was for the king. You believed it was sealed to honor him, to preserve his body, to ferry his soul. But the longer you stare into its architecture, the more a reversal emerges. The pharaoh did not outlive his tomb, the tomb outlived the pharaoh. And in that inversion, everything you assumed about time, about legacy, about the human role in history begins to collapse. The king dies, the body decays, the dynasty falters, the kingdom erodes. Sand swallows, empires fracture, languages dissolve, yet the tomb remains. The limestone does not kneel to conquest, the geometry does not crumble with memory. In a world where everything is consumed, the tomb is the one object that survives consumption. And so you must ask, was it ever built for the pharaoh at all? Or was the pharaoh simply the excuse, the catalyst, the sacrifice required to bring the tomb into existence? Think of it another way. In biology, organisms build structures, spiders spin webs, bees make hives, humans construct cities, but once built, these structures reshape the life within them. A hive is not for bees, the hive is the environment that sustains the swarm. In the same way, the tomb is not for the king is the host that allowed the tomb to manifest. The pharaoh becomes disposable, the tomb eternal. The organism sacrifices itself to birth the architecture. Archaeology admits this quietly. Look across Egypt, thousands of tombs, most plundered, their bodies gone, their treasures stolen. And yet the structures themselves remain. What endures is not flesh, not gold, not dynasty, it is stone, geometry, silence. The tomb does not care for its occupant, it was always loyal only to itself. The pharaoh thought he built his eternity, but eternity was only the tomb feeding on him, using his wealth, his labor, his obsession to ensure its own survival. Philosophy names this inversion in the paradox of the artifact. Do humans make monuments, or do monuments make humans? Do you shape history, or does history shape you? The pharaoh believed he conquered time. Instead, time conquered him by making him a vessel for architecture. He thought his tomb was his possession. Instead, he was the tomb's possession. Even in death, his identity dissolves. The name fades, the dynasty blurs, the body turns to dust. But the tomb remains. It holds power, fascination, fear. It commands archaeologists to enter, scholars to write, tourists to travel, governments to protect. The pharaoh is gone, the tomb is alive, the roles are inverted, the stone has outlived the blood. The question of who truly reigned is no longer answerable. And this is the dread realization that perhaps all your monuments, all your systems, all your creations follow the same pattern. You believe you build them to serve you. But what if they build you to serve them? Technology, cities, ideologies. What if you're their pharaoh, sacrificed so that they may persist beyond you? You think you are the master of tools, but the tomb whispers otherwise. You are the tool, you are the sacrifice, you are the corpse that guarantees their endurance. And so the truth cuts. The tomb is not a relic, it is a strategy of stone, silence, endurance. The pharaoh was the illusion, the bait, the offering. The tomb was always the true king. The pharaoh is forgotten, the tomb still rules. So now the final question emerges, sharp and unrelenting. If the tomb outlived the king, what has already outlived you? The silence that devoured the living. They tell you the tombs are silent. They call them monuments of stillness, chambers of the dead. But that is a lie. Silence here is not the absence of sound. It is an active force, a devourer, a predator that consumes everything it touches. Step into the tomb and you do not hear silence. You hear the slow erasure of yourself. Psychologists once called it sensory deprivation when the mind is starved of external input. Locked in such chambers, people report hallucinations, loss of identity, the sensation of floating outside time. The tombs, with their depth, their sealed walls, their measured geometry, performed this experiment millennia before science gave it a name. They were deprivation engines, stone laboratories built not to honor death but to dismantle consciousness. The silence was the scalpel peeling away the self. Even archaeologists admit it, though they never say it aloud. Spend too long in a tomb and time ceases to behave. Minutes stretch into hours, heartbeats blur into echoes, the body feels both heavy and weightless. You lose yourself in the architecture, in the angles, in the air. The silence eats your thought. You emerge altered, drained, as though the tomb has taken something from you and replaced it with nothing. And here lies the inversion. The living entered to honor the dead, but it was always the living that were consumed. Priests who performed rituals here did not leave untouched. They left fragmented, altered, fractured by the silence. Workers who built the walls never left whole. The silence swallowed their sweat, their breath, their final exhausted sighs. The tomb feasted on the living long before it guarded the dead. Philosophers of mind call this the horror of the void, that the absence of sensation is not neutral but corrosive. You believe silence is peace, but silence, this absolute, is annihilation. It does not cradle the mind, it dissolves it. In the tomb, you realize the terrifying truth. It is not the body that dies first, it is the self. And perhaps this was the true design. The pharaoh believed he was building eternity for his soul, but the silence was not built for him. It was built to prove that all selves, all voices, all names collapse into one identical nothing.